welcome back, everyone, to another week of Ramban a la Parsha. This week we begin a new Sefer Vayikra, and the plan for today is to do only two Rambans on the Parsha, two significant Rambans. One is the Ramban's introduction to Sefer Vayikra, where, as he does for other Sifrei Torah, he's going to try to come up with a theme that fits the entire Parsha. Then a Ramban on the meaning of Korbanos, a famous Ramban, Machlokas Rambam and Ramban on what the Korbanos are. And then if we have time, we're Zocher the Shabbos to read Parsha Zachor. There is an interesting part of a Ramban in Kiseitze on Parsha Zachor, so if we have time, we'll do that as well. Okay, let's start with the Ramban's introduction to Sefer Vayikra. And here I just want to emphasize, as the Ramban did with Sefer Shmos, he really does his best to try to have a theme and try to include the entire Sefer, or as much of the Sefer as he can. So says the Ramban, HaSefer Hazehu Torat Kohanim Uleviyim. Right, this is a book, as it's called in Chazal, Torat HaKohanim. It's talking about Kohanim and Leviyim. Or there's another girsa, Kohanim HaLeviyim, as the Psukim sometimes describe Kohanim as also Leviyim, since they come from Shevet Levi. Yiva'er bo inyanei hakarbanot kulan umishmeret hamishkan. Right, the theme is going to be Korbanos and mishmeret hamishkan, and making sure that the Mishkan properly operates, and that's going to be key in the Ramban. Ki ka'asher hayas sefer acher beinyan hagalut v'hageula mimenu. The previous Sefer Shmos, was all about exile and redemption. V'hi shlimo b'inyan oel moed uchvod Hashem asher maleh et hamishkan. And last week's parsha Pekude ended with the Shechina being revealed in the Mishkan. After that, he says, Tzivahu b'karbanot u'bishmirat hamishkan sheyihiyu hakarbanot kapara lahen v'lo yigremu ha'avonot l'siluk hashchina. So obviously now we need a mechanism by which God will remain amongst us, and our sinning won't cause, God forbid, the Shechina to leave us. So, v'tziva b'kohanim hanigashim al Hashem she'id kadashu. He also has to command the Kohanim to retain their holiness, to mekadesh themselves before the avoda. She'hizhir al tumat mikdashu kadashav. So it's not just the Korbanos, which, as we'll see, are Vayikra and Tzav, but it goes beyond that, because we want to protect the base. We want to protect the Mishkan. V'gam shelo yersu la'alot el Hashem kemo shamar daber al Aaron achicha v'al yavo b'chol eit el hakodesh mibeit la'parochet al pnei hakaporet asher al ha'aron v'lo yamut ki be'anan eroel hakaporet. Right? Only Aaron can go into the Kodesh HaKodashim. Only Kohanim can go into the Kodesh. Oh, there are limits. There are restrictions, very much like there were at Har Sinai. Right, as we've seen before, and we'll see again, the Ramban compares the Mishkan to Maimat Har Sinai, and so the rules are similar. Ka'azharat pen yehersu al Hashem lirot v'nafal mimenu rav, as the pasuk says with respect to Har Sinai, people have to remain in their designated areas. Va'achar kach yagbil hamishkan kahagbalat Har Sinai be'eit hayot sham kvod Elokei Yisrael. Afterwards, I think here he means in Sefer Bamidbar, when the Torah tells us where the encampments are and where every shevet has to be, he says, that's like at Har Sinai, where we were told where we could stand. V'hinei, rov ha-sefer hazeh b'karbanot. Now, you could debate that, because Vayikra and Tzav is not rov ha-sefer, but he means thematically, most of the Sefer deals with Korbanot, b'torat ha-karban ha-makrivim u'b'makom she'it karev bo. Right, what you bring and where you bring it. V'yavo bo ktsat mitzvot nigrarot im eila. And then obviously, if you're talking about the theme of a whole sefer, so there'll be other mitzvos that are attached to, that are related to Korbanot. Ki mitchilat tziva b'karbanot hanidava. Sefer Parshas Vayikra is all about voluntary Korbanot nidava. Associated with that is v'asar hachela v'hadam ba'avuram, and you need to know what parts you can bring on mizbech and what parts you can't. V'acharei kein tziva b'karbanot hachet. That's Parshas Tzav. Obligatory Korbanot to be mechaper for avonot that we do, and it's going to happen. V'nigrar achar ze lahazkir ha'ma'achalim ha'asurim ba'avur shehem tmeim, shehem mitamim. Right? Then what's the transition from obligatory korbanot for forgiveness to foods that we can eat? Foods that we can eat are described in the Torah as mitameh. So they're mitameos. So therefore the Torah includes it in Vayikra. Right? We don't really think of it at the time, but when the Torah tells us if you eat this food, you can't come to the Beis HaMikdash, you can't come to the Mishkan. You're tameh. V'im nichnas sham betuma, and if God forbid you enter the Beis HaMikdash betuma, yiyech chayav karban olav yared sheizkir kfar. You're going to have to bring a different karban. I think this is what the Ramban means by most of the Sefer dealing with Korbanot, meaning not directly, but indirectly. V'hutzrach lahazkir torat hamitzora u'mishpitei hayoledet v'hazav v'hazava l'chayev otam b'karban u'lahazhir od mitumatam kasher mar b'sofam. What does this have to do? Okay, that's Vayikra Tzav Shemini. What does that have to do with Tazria Mitzora? They're forms of Tumah. You're not allowed to go to the Beis HaMikdash if you're a Mitzora. You're not allowed to go to the Beis HaMikdash if you're Zav. And you have to bring Korbanot to be Mitaher you. Okay, so it's part of the same theme. V'hizartem et b'nei Yisrael mitumatam v'lo yamutu b'tumatam b'tamam et mishkan yasher b'tocham. Right? It's not usur for a Jew to become tameh. Absolutely not. It's problematic, and maybe it's usur for a Kohen who has to work in the Mikdash to become tameh, because then he can't. For the rest of us, and the Ramban's going to point this out, Sefer Vayikra is not really addressed to the rest of us. It's addressed to the Kohanim and the Leviim, except for certain exceptions. V'nigrar achar zeh sheyazhir al ha'arayot. So after Tazria Mitzora, for some reason, he skips Achremos right now. No, he doesn't skip Achremos. He's saying in Achremos, one of the major themes of Achremos, apologies, is Arayot. He says the Arayot, ki mishkavam mitameh, they belong in the Sefer because the result of a prohibited relationship is Tumah. Va'avonam yikarei Tumah. The sin itself is described as Tameh. Goremet l'siluk hashchina v'legalut. And obviously it causes the Shechina to leave us, and it causes exile, both of which relate to the theme. Va'od, ki hashogeg bahen mechuyav hachatat shehizkir kvar boam nefesh achat techata bishkaga. And also, people who sin this way have to bring Korbanot to get kapara. Va'acharei kein hizkir mitzvat hashabat u'moadei Hashem ba'avur hakarban. Right? Shabbos has a special Korban Musaf. Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, all have special Korbanot. That qualifies within the theme of the Sefer. Therefore, Parshat Emor is mostly about the special days and Korbanot. Kumo Shamar, Eila Moadei Hashem Hashem Mikroi Kodesh Hashem Tukotam B'Moadam. La'akrivi Shel Hashem Olam. Right? It's all about Korbanos. Obviously, Parshas Pinchas in Bamidbar is more about Korbanos. But says the Ramban, in terms of building a theme for Sefer Vayikra, it makes sense to include the Chagim described through their special Korbanot. V'rov parshiot ha-sefer hazeh yidaber b'hanim ha-kohanim. Now, overwhelmingly, of course, it makes sense that Vayidaber Hashem Moshe lemor daber el ha-kohanim, emor el ha-kohanim, that's in our Sefer. Daber el Aaron ve'el banav lemor, tzavet Aaron ve'el banav lemor. So what about Parshas Kedoshim? Parshas Kedoshim, u'b'Parshas Kedoshim, k'tzas mitzvot libnei Yisrael, Ruban nigrorot im inyanei hakarbanot o bedomim lahem. Okay, says the Ramban, he's not really going to explain it, but Parshas Kedoshim, which starts with Daber el kol adat b'nei Yisrael, not just the Kohanim, he says it deals with the theme of the Sefer. Maybe as we go through the Parshas, we can return to this Ramban and see if it really holds up. Uvimikomam afaresh be'ezrato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As we go through it, says the Ramban, I'll explain to you what each of the themes are doing in Sefer Vayikra. Now, interestingly, the Ramban leaves out from his description of the Sefer even a hint of Bahar and Bechukotai. right? This is probably because, he'll deal with it then, but it's probably because Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor daber b'nei Yisrael Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe behar Sinai lemor, right? It's out of place. Bahar and Bechukotai was told to Moshe Rabbeinu not in the Mishkan, but earlier, still at Har Sinai. So why that is and what it's doing in Sefer Vayikra, we can deal with when we get there. But at least the theme of the Ramban is clear. The theme of the Ramban is Korbanot and issues relating to Korbanot. So issues relating to Tumah and Tara, which is what sinning is often called in the Torah. Eating treif is called being mitame yourself, even though literally it's not. That's the theme of the Sefer, and that's the theme that the Ramban will point out as we go through the Sefer. Okay, that is the entirety of the Ramban's introduction to Sefer Vayikra. I hope it was clear what's going on and what we can expect as we go through the Sefer. Now, it's interesting. On the pasuk in the first parak in Vayikra, there's a famous Ramban which has his machlokas with the Rambam. The pasuk says, "V'kirbo achrav yirchatz b'mayim, v'hiktir hakohenet hakol hamizbecha ola ishay reach nichach ladonai." Okay, it's a pasuk about the Korban Ola. It's Perek Aleph, pasuk Tet. My sense is the Ramban could have written this on any pasuk. He chose this pasuk to write about, but it's not so much about the pasuk as about the theme. And the theme is one that I'm sure each and every one of us has thought of from time to time, which is, what's going on with Korbanot? What's the point of Korbanot? Right? There's such an important theme in the Torah. What is a Korban? What does it mean to bring a Korban? So the Ramban first is going to begin with the Rambam and the Moreh Nevuchim. And it's interesting, the Ramban was not a big fan of the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim. He was a big fan of the Rambam, but not the Moreh Nevuchim. Yet, I think I've said this before, the Ramban did more to publicize the Moreh Nevuchim than almost anyone else. Because almost every issue in the Moreh Nevuchim that we know of, if you didn't learn the Moreh, you got from the Ramban ala Torah. Says the Ramban, V'amar harav b'mor ha-nevuchim, Ki tam ha-korbanot ba'avur shehamitzrim v'hakastim asher hayu Yisrael garim v'toshavim ba'artzam me'olam hayu ovdim libakar v'letzon. Says the Rambam, the fact of the matter is, Bnei Yisrael grew up in Mitzrayim and with the Kastim, both of whom worshipped animals. They worshipped the bakar and the tzon. Ki hamitzrim ovdim litzla, Egyptians worshipped sheep. V'hakastim ovdim lishedim asher yiru lahem bidmut seirim. And the Kastim worshipped, types of gods that appeared to them as seirim, as goats, I suppose. Va'anshe hodu, right? If you go to India, he says adayom lo yishretu bakar laolam. They would never shave, right? There are cows walking around the street. So says the Rambam, ba'avur kain tziva lishchot eila hashlosha minim. So therefore, God commanded us to sacrifice these three species: l'shem hanichbad, to God Almighty, kidei sheyivada ki hadavar shehem choshvim ki hem betachlit ha'avera, that which the Mitzrim and the Kasdim thought was the ultimate sin, killing an animal, hu asher yakrivu labore. That's exactly what we do to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ubo yitkapru ha'avonot. And through sacrificing animals, we will achieve forgiveness. Ki kain yitra. Now the Rambam makes an editorial comment. Ki kain yitrapu ha'emunot haraot shehem madvei hanefesh. Because that's how, says the Rambam, when there's something wrong, when there's an idea that pervades society but it's wrong, you have to do the opposite. Or more specifically, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands us to do the opposite so that people will stop thinking X. Right? People will stop worshiping animals. How? When we decide to bring animals as our form of service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, people will know that animal worship is wrong. Ki kol madvei v'chol choli lo yitrapu, ki im behefchan. If you want to prove something wrong, you have to do the opposite. Hence, Korbanot. Okay, so the Rambam has a fascinating idea. It's a theme that you see many, many times in the Moreh Nevuchim, and maybe it's one of the reasons people criticize the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam thinks that many mitzvos exist to change the world's position or to change our position on various ideas, right? Lahotzi milibam shel ovdei avodah zarah. So therefore we do the opposite of avodah zarah. And says the Ramban very harshly, Eile dvarav ubahem ha'erich v'hinehem divrei havai. Says the Ramban, it's silly. It doesn't make any sense. The Ramban seems offended, really more offended than usual here. He says, Yirapu shever gadol v'kushel rabba al mikleh. The Rambam has some silly idea, and he's going to use it to answer the most fundamental questions in the Torah. The whole purpose of Korbanot are just to change the minds and just to change the attitudes of Ovdei Avodah Zarah. Ya'asu shulchan Hashem migoal she'einenu rak lahotzi miliban shel rishaim v'tipshei olam. Right there, you would say the whole reason for Korbanos is simply to change the mind of Ovdei Avodah Zarah. That doesn't make any sense, says the Ramban. He's offended by it. Va'akatuv amar ki heim lechem ishel l'reach nichoach. Says the Ramban, the pasuk is clear. The Torah wants you to bring Korbanos because they're lechem ishei reach nichoach. They're an appeasing fragrance to God. God, there's something positive about Korbanot. It's not just, says the Ramban, to try to convince people that there's no avodah zarah in the world. And the Ramban goes on to sort of beat on the Rambam, literally and figuratively, and we'll just pick up again a few lines later. He says, "V'hinei Noach b'tzeito min hateva im shloshet banav." Right? Noach came out of the teva with his 3 sons. Ein ba'olam kasti o mitzri. Right? Who's he trying to show is worshiping avodah zarah? There's no one else in the world. There's just them. There's no kastim. There's no mitzriim. Hikriv karban vayitav beinei Hashem. It's such a strong proof. Ramban says, how could the Rambam be right? When Noach was the only person in the world and there were no ovdei avodah zarah, he brought a karban and God loved it. Va'amar bo vayarach Hashem et reach hanichoach. Umimenu amar el libo lo osif od lekalel ta'adama bavur ha'adam. That's in the Pesukim in Noach. Obviously, there's something positive about it. Obviously, there's something that God loves about Korbanos. V'hevel hevi gam hu mibcharot sono mechal v'hen vayisha Hashem el hevel min chato. Right? Adam's own children, before there's avodah zarah in the world, God loved the carbon of hevel. V'lo haya adayin ba'olam shemetz avodat gilulim klal. None of this existed, and Bilam did it, etc., etc. Says the Rambam can't be right. It can't be that a mitzvah that's so pervasive, that's so important to avodas Hashem, exists only to help us uproot avodah zarah. When the Torah makes clear, says the Ramban, that God loves karbanos. So then what is it? We'll just finish the attack. He says, V'chalila shelo yihiyeh bohem shum to'elet v'ratzon rak sholalut la'avodat gilulim midat hashotim. Inconceivable, says the Ramban, that there's no benefit to karbanos other than showing over the avodah zarah that they're wrong. V'yoter ra'u lishmo hatam shomrim. It's not clear who the omrim are. It could be the Ibn Ezra. It could be others. Ki ba'avur. So what is the reason? Here's the Ramban saying. Ki ba'avur shema'asei b'nei adam nigmarim b'machshava u'b'dibur u'b'ma'aseh. He says everything that human beings do are associated with machshava. There's a thought to do the sin. There's a dibur. There's the speech, and there's the action. Tziva Hashem ki ka'asher yecheta v'yavi karban. So when somebody sins, right? Now you could ask, this is only karbanos chova. What about karbanos nedava? We'll get there. But he says when somebody sins and he brings a karban, yismoch yadav alav kineged ha'maaseh. He has to rest his hands on the animal. That's kineged the maaseh. You did something wrong. V'yitvadeh b'fiv kineged hadibur. And he'll admit his sin out loud with his mouth. That's going to fix sins that are b'dibur. V'yisrof ba'esh hakerev ha'klayot. And you're going to burn in the fire on the mizbeach the innards and the kidneys. Shehem kli ha'machshava v'hatava. That's the source of thought That's the source of desire. Va'akra'ayim, the legs or the hands, kineged yadav raglav shel adam ha'osim kol malachto. Right? The legs are kineged our hands, which do the sins. V'yizrok hadam al hamizbeach kineged damo b'nafsho, and you spill the blood on the mizbeach. Right? That's the idea of damo b'nafsho. Kidei sheyachshov adam ba'asoto kol eleh, ki chata leilokav b'gufo uvenavsho. It brings a person to look at the animal literally. The Ramban, in a separate essay in Torah Tamima, makes this point. You're supposed to see the animal as being in your place. You're supposed to look at your actions and your words and your thought as you bring the korban and say to yourself, it's supposed to be me on the mizbeach, but God has allowed me to bring a korban. V'ra'ui lo sheyishpoch damo v'yisrof gufo. The blood I see of the animal should have been my blood. The animal being burned on the mizbeach, that should be me. Lulei chesed haborei shelakach mimenu timura, were it not for the grace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who willingly accepted an exchange for me, v'chiper hakarban hazeh shehei damo tachat damo, and he allowed the animal's blood to take the place of my blood, and nefesh tachas nefesh, and the animal's soul to take the place of my soul. V'rashei evrei hakarban keneged rashei evarav, right? And the parts of the animal to take the place of my parts. V'hamanot lahachayot bohen morei haTorah shitpalu alav, and the portion that we give to the Kohanim and the Levim of certain Korbanos, that's a gift to the teachers of Torah, who will then daven for us. Okay, so all of those apply to Korbanos Chova for sure. Maybe they apply to Korbanos Nedava. What about Korbanos Tzibur? Says the Ramban. V'karban hatamid, right? The daily korban that we all bring. Ba'avu shelo yinatzlu harabe mechato tamid. There's no way the people are not going to sin. Of course they will. Sometimes more chamor, sometimes less chamor. But the entirety of Klal Yisrael, you would assume every day somebody somewhere does a sin. Ve'ele dvarim mitkablim moshchim halev kidivrei agada. Says the Ramban, unlike the Rambam, this idea makes sense. It speaks to me. It's moshchim et halev kidivrei agada. Now I want to make clear, I think moshchim et halev kidivrei agada means it's a beautiful idea. Is this really, really, really what the Ramban thinks of Korbanos? Up to a point, I think it's true. Then the Ramban's going to start al derech ha'emet on Kabbalistic ideas. So I don't know that this is the entirety for the Ramban. But this is the headquarters in the Torah for the famous machlokas Rambam, that Korbanot are lahotzi milibam shel obdei avodah zarah, right? Doing the opposite of what they do. They pray to animals. We sacrifice animals to make the point that they're wrong. The Ramban is completely offended by that idea, that the idea of Korbanot is simply, to counteract avodah zarah. The Ramban thinks the idea of Korbanot is that Korban takes my place, and that the smichas hayadayim is to remind me of the sins that I've done with my hands, and that the vidui is to remind me of sins that I've done with my mouth, and the blood and the nef, all these things are to take my place, and to make it clear that when I look at the animal on Mizbeach, I should be thinking to myself, that's me, that should be me. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in His great rachamim, allowed me to bring a korban in place of what otherwise should have been me. Okay, that's the point of Korbanot. We have a few minutes, so let's go to the Ramban on Kiteitzei, the Ramban on Parshas Zachor, which we're going to read this Shabbat. There's an introduction to the piece. It's the very last Ramban in Parshas Kiteitzei, and I'll pick up maybe a third of the way through the Ramban, maybe more. V'hanachon be'enai, says the Ramban, what I think is true about Parshas Zachor. Shehu lomar, shelo tishkach ma she'asa lanu Amalek, ad shenimcha et shemo mitachat hashamayim. So the first thing is pretty straightforward, right? Amalek is evil. Amalek is bad. Amalek didn't attack us for any reason. These are Rambans we've seen in other Parshiot. They didn't have any land. They were nomads. But they were the first. Reshit Goyim Amalek, they were the first to attack us, and we hate them for it. We have to wipe them out. And then an interesting line. Unisaper ze levanenu ulidorotenu. We have to tell this not just to ourselves, but to our children and to our descendants. Lo mai lohem kein asa lanu harasha. This is what the evil, hateful people did to us. V'lachein nitztavinu limchot et shemo. And therefore, we have to wipe him out. It's almost like the Ramban thinks, just like at the Seder, we have a mitzvah to tell our children, our grandchildren, and our whole families the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's almost like we have to sit around at the Shabbos table on Shabbos and Parshas Zachor and talk about the evil. Now, it's much easier this year because the evil that was represented by Amalek is the evil that's represented by Hamas, and the events of October 7th are not anything I have to expand on. But the idea that there is evil in the world, and that recognizing that there's evil in the world, and that the only way to get rid of it is to wipe it out completely, will remind us of why we're fighting. And this year more than ever, I think, at this point, months into the war, maybe we need a reminder. Maybe it's already time that people have forgotten what happened on October 7th. And says the Ramban, that's what happens. You have to sit down with your family and you have to explain to them why it is that we must fight evil. Not that we can, but that we must. And if we don't, that evil will remain and it will be something we'll have to deal with for generations. That's the first point in the Ramban. But then comes a bigger point. He says, V'chein b'ma'aseh Miriam. Right? The Ramban thinks there are 6 mitzvos that we have to remember all the time. One of them is Ma'aseh Miriam, which we understand to mean Miriam speaking Lashon Hara about her brother Moshe Rabbeinu. Nitztavinu lahodia levanenu ulesaper bo lidorot. Right? We have to tell our children about that, and we have to speak about it all the time. Va'af al pi shahaya ro'ui gam lahastiro shelo ledaber bignutan shel tzadikim. Right? But Miriam was a tzadikes. Why do we want to speak Lashon Hara about her? Why do we want to talk about it? Aval tziva hakatuv lahodio ulegaloto kidei shetehei azharat Lashon Hara suma b'fihem. He says, Avodah Zarah is so common, we have to try to wipe it out. And if that involves telling over a bad story about Miriam, so it is. Mipnei shehu chet gadol v'gorem ra'ot rabot. Avodah Zarah is a terrible sin, and it causes horrible evil. Uvnei adam nichshalim bo tamid, kemo she'amru v'hakol ba'avak lashon hara. You can always assume that somebody spoke a form of, a cousin of Avodah Zarah. Says the Ramban, when we have a choice between showing incredible respect for Miriam and speaking about her sin so that we can wipe out Avodah Zarah, we have to do so. Right? And this, I think, reflects the Ramban's idea. Was Miriam a tzadikes? Absolutely. Is she somebody who's a role model for us? Absolutely. Like Abraham, like Sarah. But they weren't malachim. And from time to time, they made a mistake. And the Ramban thinks we, the readers of Tanakh, the Jews who follow HaKadosh Baruch Hu, are sophisticated enough to see both things. Who wouldn't love Miriam? But at the same time, to recognize that Miriam made a mistake. And that mistake is called Lashon Hara. And the more we remind ourselves of that, the more we'll remember to avoid speaking Lashon Hara. Right? The idea that you could have somebody great who also sinned is acceptable to the Ramban. The Ramban thinks that those people exist in the Torah. Right? Not everybody is God. And we can have incredible respect for them while at the same time recognizing their flaws. It reminds me, somebody once wrote a book about how if Charedim had to describe, Sefer Bereshis into Shmos, there would be, the brothers had some machlokes in Torah or something, and then they landed up in Mitzrayim. Right? There's a lot of Lashon Hara, so to speak, in the story of going down to Mitzrayim and Yosef and his brothers, and it's cringeworthy. But the Ramban would say that's what the Torah is. The Torah is an honest sefer that tells you about the great things that people did, and also sometimes includes their mistakes. And their mistakes can turn into a mitzvah saseh. You have to remember what Miriam did. Why? because it'll stop us. It'll help us to fight Avodah Zarah. Just like remembering what Amalek did will help us to remember that there is pure evil in the world. It's not dominant, not at all times, but there's evil in the world. And if we can recognize there's evil in the world, we'll understand why we're commanded to wipe it out. Yashkach to everybody. Have a great, great Parsha Zachor and a lovely, wonderful, enjoyable Purim. And see you next week. Shabbat Shalom.